Welcome to Behalt. Behalt is a historical mural 10 feet high and 265 feet long, located at the Mennonite Information Center in Berlin, Ohio. It depicts the history of the Anabaptists, the Mennonites, Amish, and Hutterites. The name Behalt comes from the German word behalten, which means to keep, to retain, and to remember. The painting and research was done by Heinz Gogel. It was started in 1978 and finished in 1992. The people, places, events, and dates are historically documented. The name Anabaptist is a Latin translation of the German name Wiedertäufer, or one that has been baptized again. The founders of the new faith had been baptized as babies in the Catholic Church. They called themselves Schweizer Brüder, or Swiss Brethren. And in Holland they are still known as the Doopsgezinden, or baptism-minded. And now here's their story.
Behalt, in search of love and understanding. The crosses are bare, the tomb is empty. He has risen. His countenance was like lightning, and his raiment white as snow. Mary and Mary Magdalene came and held him by his feet and worshipped him. 2 apostles met him at Emmaus, and he said, "Peace be unto you. Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I." He met his apostles and told them, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." So the apostles went out into the countryside, into the marketplaces, and into the desert to spread the word about the resurrection. At Pentecost, Peter baptized 500 people from all walks of life. This marked the growth and spread of the Christian faith. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John started to write the New Testament. Immediate persecution followed. It was not until 300 years later that Emperor Constantine legitimized the church and accepted Christianity as a state religion. His troops were baptized by marching them through a river. Instant Christians. The church was established with all rules made to control marriage, confession, mass, absolution, and the adoration of relics. All became church rituals. Slowly the church spread and became established in Europe. Churches and monasteries were built. In the 5th century, St. Patrick brought the new religion to Ireland. In 675, St. Boniface convinced the Saxons and Frisians of the validity of his faith by escaping the wrath of Wotan. In contradiction to local legend, he was not killed by Wotan's blitz after cutting the Wotan's oak, but lost his life at the hand of the Frisians. In spite of his death, the Christian belief spread from southern Germany to northern Germany. However, there were early protesters against the government-controlled church. Donatius and later Novatianus and their followers were persecuted and eventually wiped out by the state church for their protests. During the Middle Ages, power was shared between the church and state. The leaders of the church and the princes of the state often came from the same families, and they enriched themselves by joint exploitation of the masses. From 1096, the Crusaders fought to regain control of the Holy Land from Islam. In 1255, 50,000 children went on the so-called Children's Crusade, and almost all perished within a month. Protests against the church continued. The Templars, as well as the Valdensians, the followers of Peter Valdo, were ruthlessly persecuted. In the year 1212, 80 of them were burnt in one day in Strasbourg. All kinds of new groups appeared. The Knights of the Cross pushed into the Baltic. Flagellants ran amok through the streets, believing that self-punishment would bring them closer to heaven. However, reason prevailed. In 1360 AD, John Wycliffe preached directly from the Bible in English. For this, he was heavily criticized, but escaped further punishment. Some years later, in 1414, John Hus, who preached in the Czech language, was not so fortunate. He was invited to the city of Constance to defend his action, with guarantees for his safety. In spite of that, he was taken prisoner and condemned to death. He was burnt at the stake, wearing a dunce's cap emblazoned with dancing devils. With the invention of the printing press in 1445 by Gutenberg, a whole new world was opened to the masses. Information spread rapidly and brought on a change of enormous proportions. The quick spread of ideas broadened the knowledge of the people. The formerly ignorant population became literate and enlightened. They were able to read the scriptures with understanding. When the need arose for the Pope to raise money for the building of the Vatican, the sale of indulgences was approved, and the monk Tetzel became the most active salesman, with the words, "Wenn der Kreuzer im Beutel klingt, die Seele aus dem Feuer springt." As soon as the coin sounds in the purse, your soul will jump out of the fire. He lured money for the papist coffers from the rich and poor alike. Dissatisfaction with the church and the clergy became more and more evident. In 1517, the German monk Martin Luther aired his dissatisfaction by nailing his 95 theses to the church door of Wittenberg. Unknowingly, this man had started the Reformation. Defending his stand at the Diet of Worms before the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, he said, "Hier stehe ich. Ich kann nicht anders. Gott helfe mir weiter." Here I stand. I can't do otherwise. Lord, help me to continue. 1 year later, Ulrich Zwingli started his own reform in Zurich. The Reformation was in full swing. Unrest developed throughout the church and population. Some of the clergy left the church and, like Luther, decided to get married and put their dishonest way of life behind them. Michael Sattler left his post as an abbot at a monastery. Simon Stumpf resigned the priesthood. Johann Reublin carried the open Bible in the Easter procession, drawing criticism from the authorities. People refused to go to church and banded together in Bible reading groups being held in their homes. Balthasar Hubmeier removed all statues and paintings from his church in Waldshut in the Black Forest, foreboding the later Bildersturm. In 1524, a young man by the name of Menno Simons was consecrated a Catholic priest and spent most of his time drinking, gambling, carousing, and saying Mass on Sundays. Ulrich Zwingli had universal support for his reforms, including the city council. 3 young men were his closest advisors. All 3 of them were deeply devoted, well educated, and spoke several languages. The leading figure among them was 26-year-old Konrad Grebel, the son of a nobleman and member of the city council. His best friend was Felix Mons, somewhat older and a former member of the Pope's famous Swiss Guard. He was the illegitimate son of the deacon of the Grossmünster in Zurich. Georg Ko-Jakob, or Jörg from Haus Jakob, also known as Blaurock for the blue coat he wore, was a fiery, energetic, temperamental Alpine priest. He left the priesthood and became a powerful proponent of the new ideas. Zwingli had promised strong reforms, which were wholeheartedly accepted by his followers. However, the city council forced him into moderating his stand. During public discussions, he repudiated his stand on many items, including infant baptism, confession, and the Mass. During a disputation, January 17th to 20th, Heated discussions erupted, and a total break occurred between Zwingli and Grabel, Mans and Blaurock. Confused and frustrated, they met the next day, January 21st, 1525, in the home of Felix Mans's mother, just around the corner from the Grossmünster. Not knowing what to do, Georg Blaurock went down on his knees in front of Konrad with the words, "Konrad, in Gottes Namen taufe mich." Konrad, in God's name, baptize me. Konrad Grabel baptized Blaurock, who in turn then baptized the others present, upon their confession of faith. This became the first documented adult baptism of modern times. This was repeated many times in homes and public fountains. The membership in the new group grew rapidly and spread like wildfire. Zwingli and the council acted immediately against the three leaders and some of their followers. With outside help, they were able to escape and went into hiding. Called Wiedertäufer, to baptize again, by the opposition, the adherents of the new faith simply knew each other as Brüder or brethren. The first to lose his life for the new movement was Eberli Bolt, who was preaching forcefully and successfully near St. Gallen. In May of 1525, he became a martyr by being burnt at the stake. The three original leaders, Grabel, Mans, and Blaurock, perished within a few years. Konrad Grabel died of the pestilence in 1526. His grandson, another Konrad, became pastor of the Grossmünster in Zurich. Felix Mans was condemned and was drowned in the Limmat River and became the first martyr to be killed by the Protestants. His hands were tied below his knees. In this position, he was held underwater until he died. His mother and brother encouraged him to keep his faith by praying and shouting from the edge of the river. On the same day, Blaurock was beaten out of the city and banished. He went on to preach and baptize hundreds in the Alps. In 1529, he was taken prisoner, and together with Peter Langenegger, was burnt at the stake in Clausen in Tyrol. Thus ended the first stage of the Anabaptist group. Many were taken prisoner and held at the infamous Traxelwald Castle, which has become a point of pilgrimage for Anabaptist groups.
Now, with the death of Grabel, Mans, and Blaurock, the first generation of strong leaders was lost. It was not until 20 years later that a new strong leadership emerged. Pilgrim Marpeck was in southern Germany and in Switzerland, Dirk Willems in Prussia, and Menno Simons in the Netherlands and northern Germany.
The new faith had grown rapidly, supported by some of the leading minds of the time. Hubmaier baptized Hans Denk, an outstanding thinker and scholar. Hans Denk converted Hans Hut, who took on an important role in the development of the new movement. A gathering of brethren took place in Augsburg in 1527. It was later called the Martyrs' Synod, since many of the participants later were executed for their beliefs. Also in 1527, a lengthy meeting of Swiss brethren took place in the small Swiss village of Schleitheim. The result of this meeting was the writing of the so-called Schleitheim Confession. Containing 7 articles of faith, it became the foundation for the new faith. The whole group of Anabaptists, Mennonites, Amish, and Hutterites have the same basic beliefs: separation of church and state, refusal to take up arms, non-participation in politics, believers in adult baptism, and refusal to install a hierarchy. It is believed that one of the authors of the Schleitheim Confession was Michael Sattler, who had left the post of abbot of a monastery and had married. On his way from Schleitheim to Rottenburg in southern Germany, he and his group of followers were arrested. The Schleitheim Confession was found in his possession and used against him in his trial. He was accused of heresy by leaving the cloister and marrying. He was burnt at the stake with 4 other faithful believers. His trial and the conversations during it are still on record. A big part of the population was against the trial, and the nearby University of Tübingen refused to take part in the charade and would not send any qualified judges. To disable Mikhail Sattler from talking, he was taken to the market square, where in front of the still existing fountain, his tongue was cut out, and 5 pieces of flesh were torn out of his body with glowing prongs. He was nailed on a wagon and driven to the place of execution. 3 more pieces of muscle were torn from him, after which he was bound on a ladder and thrown on the fire. His wife and others refused, after much urging, to recant. They were bound into sacks with heavy stones around their necks and drowned in the Neckar River. The new belief spread rapidly, followed by persecution. Both the Catholics and Protestants participated fanatically. There existed a variety of reasons for the persecution. The combined church and state, having absolute power over people, felt their position of power threatened. In 1525, the peasants began their uprising. With the Battle of Frankenhausen, the conflict came to a climax and ended with a bloodbath for the German peasantry, diminishing any hope of freedom. Their leader, Thomas Münzer, was torn to pieces. The revolt collapsed. The ruling classes reacted violently against any change in the status quo. To keep control, armed forces in the form of mercenaries were required. The recruits were mainly from young peasant stock. The refusal to take up arms by the new faith jeopardized the establishment of sufficient troops. Therefore, it became necessary to eradicate the new movement. A focal point of rest and tolerance developed in the lands of the Count of Liechtenstein in the small town of Nikolsburg, Moravia. The Count, a vassal of the Habsburg Emperor, had become a convert and welcomed the hunted refugees into his domain. The population rose from 3,000 to almost 15,000 in a short time. Different opinions were formed regarding the lifestyle, political position, and the use of weapons. 2 groups emerged, with Hans Huth, spokesman for one, and Balthasar Hubmeier for the other. The Huth group refused participation in worldly affairs and politics, insisting on a total separation of church and state, rejecting violence and the use of the sword, accepting only a stick to defend themselves against wild animals. Because of their stance, they were called Stäblers, named after a stab or stick. Hubmeier's followers believed self-defense with a sword and participation in government were the correct way to live. They became known as the Schwartlers. The group slowly dissipated. 100 years later, their ideas were adopted by the Baptists. The Count sided with Hubmeier and banished the Stäblers from his land. However, he stayed very sympathetic to the group and helped them in many ways. Huth's group started to split apart. The Swabian contingent left Nikolsburg with songs on their lips and headed south toward the homeland. The persecution persisted unabated. Hundreds were tortured, burned, or beheaded. Hans Langenmantel lost his head in Weissenhorn, sitting on a chair. His arthritis prevented him from kneeling. Hans Huth accidentally burnt to death in prison. His burnt body was then condemned to death. He was tied on a chair, and the poor victim was burnt again, publicly, in the market square. Balthasar Hubmeier was burnt in Vienna with a bag of gunpowder tied to his neck to mercifully hasten his death. On New Year's Day in 1531, 17 Anabaptists were taken by surprise by the Reichsprovost Eichelin on the Mantelhof near Aalen in Württemberg, and without trial were hung from a large oak tree and burnt to death. Nearby in Schwäbisch Gmünd, in 1528, 5 men, 1 woman, and a 15-year-old boy refused to recant and were beheaded. The young boy had been promised lifelong employment by a nobleman who was present at the execution. However, he went steadfastly to his death. While these events were unfolding, some expatriates in the south had been arrested crossing the Danube River and were held prisoners in the castle of Passau. During 1528, many of the prisoners wrote letters and poems, which later were collected to become the basis of the Ausbund. This book was later used by the Amish as their hymn book, and is the oldest Protestant hymn book still in use today. A small group of 200 to 300 under Jakob Wiedemann left Nikolsburg in 1528 and headed north. They camped near the village of Baugenitz, which is no longer in existence. Here they chose ministers. These men spread a cloth before the people, and everyone laid down on it his earthly possessions, unconstrained and with a willing mind, according to the teachings of the apostles and the prophets. This was the beginning of communism by this group. They established the first Bruderhof. From Bogenitz, the brethren moved to Austerlitz on the invitation of the lords of Kumnitz. In 1529, Jakob Hutter of Tyrol visited the group. In 1533, he became head pastor of a separate group in Auschwitz. Through his efforts, strict discipline and order were established, particularly respecting community of goods. The whole movement of the Hutterite Brethren is named after him. 2 years later, he suffered a terrible martyr's death by being alternately frozen and then roasted. The Brotherhood spread rapidly in Moravia. In 1528, Pilgrim Marpeck, a mining engineer, and his family were exiled from Rottenburg in Tyrol. He moved from Augsburg to Ulm and Strasbourg, where he became well established by constructing canals for the purpose of transporting Black Forest timber. He became the leader and cornerstone of the Swiss Brethren in the Alemannic lands of southern Germany, Alsace, and Switzerland. His knowledge and skills were too valuable, and he was allowed by the authorities to live. He died of natural causes. In 1530, Melchior Hoffmann, a fiery mystic, almost fanatical preacher, baptized about 300 in the northern city of Emden and established the Anabaptist faith in the north. His followers were named after him and were known as Melchiorites. As in the south, persecution was immediate and swift. On March 20th, 1531, Menno Simons witnessed the execution of Psych Friedrich Schneider, causing him to study the Bible for the first time to find the explanation for child baptism, but found none. Unfortunately, in 1534, a group of self-proclaimed Anabaptists turned fanatic, declared a new kingdom of God, and took over the city of Münster. This group was never acknowledged by the leader of the Melchiorites, which had become known as Urbanites, after their leaders Obe and Dirk Phillips. The reign of the rebellious group in Münster came to an inglorious end with the fall of the town to imperial troops in 1535. Most survivors were executed and the leaders were hung in cages to rot. Those cages of Teufer Käfig are still hanging today from the Frauenkirche in Münster. It is assumed that Menno's brother was one of the executed, which caused the young priest to follow the Anabaptist creed, and he was baptized by Obe and Dirk Phillips. Later, Obe became disenchanted and left the congregation. His fate is unknown. With Menno's membership, the second generation of leaders after Grabel, Muntz, and Blaurock was established. Menno and his family, who had become instant refugees, became the leading figure in northern Germany and Holland, with Dirk Phillips in Prussia and Poland, and Pilgrim Marpeck in the south. Adam Pastor, a leading theologian and brilliant thinker, left the group. feeling no need for organization of any kind, declaring that the church was within each person. His large following became known as Adamite. Naturally, his group slowly dispersed, mainly because of the absence of a uniting organization. The persecution in the north became so extensive that hundreds were burnt, drowned, beheaded, hanged, and killed in other heinous ways. In 1539, Teichard Renix was beheaded because he allowed Menno to stay with him for one night. In spite of his constant movement, Menno became a prolific writer and preacher, and became known as the leading figure of the faith. The group originally called themselves Dorpsgesinde, and this has never changed to this day. Menno was accepted as leader, and the nickname of his followers became Menist, later to be known as Mennonites. Menno lived out his life in a small house known as Mennoklauser near Wittmarsum. Again, the acceptance of the new beliefs spread rapidly. In 1555, Leonard Bowens alone baptized 10,250 in the Netherlands. Their belief system valued charity and compassion, so when Calvinists fleeing from England became icebound for the whole winter on the coast of Holland, members of the Dorpsgesinde provided them with the necessities of life to safeguard their survival. In 1547, the Hutterites had to flee and had to resettle in caves and forests in Hungary. Gradually, they were able to establish their communes again, and through hard work, persistence, and perseverance, developed prosperous communities. The years from 1555 to 1600 were considered the golden years of the Hutterites. With great ingenuity and a thrifty lifestyle, they became leaders in many fields. In a time when most of the world's population was unable to read and write, they had a literacy rate of 100%. They developed horticulture to its highest level at the time. Their doctors were called to attend upon kings and nobility. Their ceramics can still be found in many museums around the world. In 1560, Bright Michael started the Hutterite history book, the Geschichtsbuch, which would be kept and protected as well as updated for over 400 years. In the meantime, persecution persisted in Switzerland. 80-year-old Hans Haslibacher was beheaded October 20th, 1571. According to the legend, prior to his execution, Hans told the executioner that his head would roll into his hat with a smile, and the sun and the water in the fountains would turn a bloody red. His prediction was validated in old tales. In Holland, the first separation occurred. They were divided into the Sunnist and the Lamist, named after their meeting place, Sun and Lam, a division that would last for many generations. The northern congregations had to meet secretly, and many services were held on small boats out at sea. One rather interesting execution took place in 1569. Dirk Willems was able to escape the prison and flee across the frozen canal. Emaciated by starvation, Dirk's light weight was supported by the thin ice. His well-fed pursuer was not so fortunate when he broke through the ice. Dirk saved the man's life by pulling him to safety. The man was ordered to arrest his savior. Without mercy, Dirk was executed. Gradually, the Dorpsgesinde became more accepted. In Krefeld, the Anabaptist Op den Graaf started an extensive silk industry, which to this day is in operation. In the east, troops of the Ottoman Empire overran the Hutterite settlements in 1605, carrying off women and children. This marked the end of the golden Hutterite years. In 1608, refugees from England arrived in Holland under the leadership of Smith and Robinson. Influenced by the Anabaptists, They had laid the foundation for the General Baptists around 1630. In 1615, Hans de Ries compiled and published the Martyrs' Spiegel. This book is found in most Amish homes and has been printed in many languages. In 1632, a great conference was called in the city of Dordrecht, resulting in new ideas and directions documented in the Dordrecht Confession of Faith. In 1651, Aaron Price writes the Hutterite Gemeindeordnung. In 1660, Van Bracht completed the Martyrs' Spiegel, Van Leuken creating the etchings for its illustration. Some of the original plates are still in existence and are owned by some local people in Holmes County and in Pennsylvania. In 1671, 700 men, women, and children were expelled by the authorities in Switzerland and were forced to leave all their belongings behind. In 1677, Penn and Fox arrived in Holland to promote settlements in the New World. Some of his settlers were of Mennonite stock. The first Anabaptist settlers arrived in 1683 on the Concord and founded Germantown in what was called Penn's Wood, later to be known as Pennsylvania.
William Penn actually traveled to Europe and invited the Anabaptists, Amish and Mennonites, to emigrate to Penn's Woods, which became Pennsylvania. This created a whole new set of questions related to their faith. How do I live out my life in a place that tolerates my religion rather than persecutes me for it? Amish and Mennonite people chose to live in fairly tight, close-knit communities, which is probably a consequence of the years of persecution they experienced while in Europe. The situation was similar to that of the early church when Constantine legalized Christianity.
In 1684, Rittenhouse preached the Anabaptist sermon in the New World. He established the first paper mill, which stayed in the possession of his descendants for 130 years. Together with the Quakers, he wrote the first publication condemning slavery. In the meantime, persecution continued. Groups of so-called Täuferjäger, Baptist hunters, received a head price for each captured Anabaptist. Instead of executing the prisoners, they were condemned to live out their lives as galley slaves. Gatherings were held in secret places like the Täuferhöhle near Zurich. 1693 became the year for the great split amongst the Swiss brethren. A group under Hans Reist became more progressive. The larger group, under the leadership of Jakob Amann in the Elsass, southern Germany, and Switzerland, continued to adhere to the Dordrecht Confession with enforcement of the Meidung, or ban, and a stricter, regulated lifestyle. The separation became permanent. The followers of Amann became known as Amish. The Reist followers called themselves simply Täufer, or later Alter Täufer. Not until the middle of the 20th century was the name Mennonites officially accepted. Today, there are no longer any Amish people in Europe. The first meeting house was erected in 1708 in Germantown. In Holland, the churches had to be hidden behind the facades of warehouses or inns. In 1720, in Schwarzenau, a German Black Forest town, Alexander Mack started a group very much related in principle to the Mennonites, but using only full immersion as a method of baptism. They became the Church of the Brethren, also known as German Baptists or Dunkers. Alexander Mack died in 1735 in Germantown, Pennsylvania. In 1711, the Mennonites sponsored the migration of the Swiss Brethren to Holland. the split between the Aman and Reist followers was so strong that they refused to go on the same raft together. In the meantime, settlers of Pennsylvania moved westward with the help of the Mennonite-built Conestoga wagon. In general, the peaceful Anabaptists were tolerated by the Indians. However, 3 members of the Hostetler family were killed and their house burned to the ground. There are hundreds of Hostetler descendants spread all over America. Friedrich of Prussia visited the Mennonites in Krefeld to investigate the refusal of their youth to join his army. He was presented with a portrait of himself. He exempted the Mennonites from army duty. In the meantime, the Hutterites were constantly harassed and their children forced to go to Catholic schools and churches. In 1761, most of the Hutterites were arrested by the Jesuits. Only 17 of them remained. Later, they were joined by the Lutherans. This group became the basis of all Hutterite communities today. Amongst the 40,000 Hutterite members, we find only 15 family names. In 1784, Catherine the Great of Russia invited German settlers into Russia and the Ukraine. In 1786, Bartsch and Hepner went into Russia to assess the feasibility of settlements and returned with a favorable report. The first settlers moved east in 1788. 55 people in 5 wagons were the first contingent. Later, 462 families settled in Kortitsa. A new branch of the Amish began when Engels and Wittmer baptized each other in the Susquehanna River near Lancaster, giving rise to the so-called River Brethren. During the American Revolution, many Mennonites resettled on the Canadian side of the Niagara Peninsula. In the cloisters of Ephrata, revolutionary soldiers used pages of the Bible and the Martyr's Mirror, being printed there as gun wadding. When General Washington found out about this, he gave strict orders to stop this abuse of the sacred document. When Amish in America became unsure of how to conduct church business, they wrote for advice to Germany. From Johannes Nafziger correspondence, in many letters from 1765 to 1766, the Ordnung governing the behavior of the Amish people was developed. Through a window, we see the famous schoolmaster of the Skipak, Christopher Dock, in prayer at his desk. He was discovered dead in that position. Jonas Stutzmann was the first settler in Holmes County. He arrived at the age of 18 and settled near Walnut Creek. He developed into a man with peculiar ideas. He always dressed in white, the only Amish man ever to do so. He believed that this was the only appropriate color for the coming of the Lord, which he proclaimed would take place in the year 1853. To accommodate Jesus, he built an oversized chair, believing him to be bigger than the average size. Jesus did not arrive. However, the Stutzmann family still possesses the chair, which is now on display at the center. He also believed that the wheel was evil, since the world and the wheel are both round, and the world, of course, is unquestionably evil. He was so adamant about this that he specified in his will that he be carried by men instead of a carriage to the cemetery. Since he died 7 miles from home, it took 2 teams of pallbearers to carry him in a severe snowstorm from Martins Creek to Walnut Creek. Unfortunately, one of the pallbearers became ill with pneumonia and died. In 1820, Christian Nafziger, an Amish man from Bavaria, landed in New Orleans, and from there he walked with all his belongings to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he acquired a horse to take him all the way to Canada. There, he was able to contact the representative of the king to ask his permission to bring his family and friends to Canada. With a letter of introduction, Christian returned to England and met the king in person, who gave him a gold coin and a recommendation to settle. They became Canada's first Amish family. Another interesting character was Chief Tom Lyon. His campsite was discovered by chance during the building of the Grace Mennonite Church next to Behalt. It was said that he used to go around scaring the women on the farm by showing them scalps. He also told them that as a young boy he took part in the Hostetler massacre. His scalps turned out to be goatskins, and his story of the massacre is highly questionable. It is said that he was shot at an old age by an irate settler. Between 1820 and 1830, there was the outbreak of the Ohio fever. Ohio at the time was a common hunting ground for many Indian tribes and was relatively sparsely populated. Settlers started to come in across the mountains and down the rivers to claim the rich farmland. A similar movement continued into Russia, and many new settlements became established. In 1833, Samuel Fröhlich, who traveled and preached extensively through Switzerland and was expelled with his family from Zurich, started a new congregation leaning heavily on Anabaptist beliefs called Neue Taufe, or New Baptists, now known as the Neue Taufgesinden Gemeinde. Fröhlich died in Strasbourg in 1857. In 1851, in Holland, the first mission board meeting took place, where it was decided to send missionaries to Java, India, the Congo, and later to Argentina and many other locations. The Church of God in Christ was formed by John Holdeman in Wayne County, Ohio, between 1868 and 1870. His group became known as Holdeman Mennonites. He was a prolific writer and died in 1900. The Religiöse Botschafter, the first official newspaper, was printed in Buck County, Pennsylvania. In 1890, the Budget was published in Sugar Creek, Ohio. The Budget has become a line of communications between all the Amish settlements, with 400 amateur writers reporting from all over the world. The Budget refuses to print scandalous and political news. During the Crimea War from 1854 to 1856, the Mennonites refused to take part in military action, as commanded by the Tsar. However, they took care of 5,000 of the wounded soldiers and nursed them back to health. As the pressure for military service increased, many looked for alternate places to live. In 1872, Workington and Wiebe were sent to the American prairies to assess conditions of the land for settlement. They found the prairies very favorable and recommended relocation. A few years later, a massive migration began from Russia to America. The so-called Russian Mennonites settled the prairies. They were descendants of northern German and Hollandish stock who had originally moved to the Vistula River and Danzig areas, and from there to the Ukraine. They spoke Plattdeutsch, Low German, in contrast to the Pennsylvania Anabaptists, who have retained much of their Pennsylvania Dutch, which is actually Deutsch, an old High German dialect. The settlers from Russia brought with them the hard, turkey-red winter wheat, the only grain able to withstand the hard weather conditions of the prairies. The success of this hardy grain transformed the prairies. The railroads opened the West, and the migration continued. Thousands settled the newly opened territories. The Russian Revolution in 1917 caused havoc and created terror and horrific situations. Most Mennonite settlements were brutally attacked numerous times. Killing, raping, burning, kidnapping, and destruction took on abhorrent dimensions. Many villages were totally destroyed. Devastation combined with crop failure caused widespread starvation and poverty. There was an appeal to their Mennonite brethren in the New World for assistance. The response was immediate. 3 young men, Arthur Schlegel, Clayton Kratz, and Ori Miller, with a big shipment of supplies, arrived before the Bolshevik troops did. Clayton Kratz was warned to leave the area. He decided to stay, reasoning that he had not harmed anybody and there was no reason for him to be afraid. Next morning at 4 a.m., soldiers knocked at the door and took him prisoner. He was last seen heading north, tied to a wagon. No one ever heard from him again. This was the beginning of the MCC, the Mennonite Central Committee, which later developed into an extremely efficient worldwide relief organization. Large groups left Russia in the early 20s, migrating mainly to the western states and western Canada.
The Anabaptists had been promised total religious freedom in the New World. However, there was still some persecution of any men who refused to go to the military. It was not until the Second World War that provisions were made to exempt the Anabaptists from military service and to let them work in forestry service or in hospitals to do their necessary time for their country.
During World War I, tremendous pressure was put on the Anabaptist groups to serve in the armed forces of the United States. The Hofer brothers, young Hutterites, were drafted but refused to take up the uniform. As punishment, they were incarcerated at Alcatraz, at that time a military prison. They were hung by their wrists, high enough so only their toes touched the floor. They got some relief by passing a chamber pot back and forth to stand on. After many days of this treatment and starvation, they were taken down and shipped to Leavenworth to be further brutalized, ridiculed, and tortured. They were made to run for hours and stand in the icy wind. They both died of pneumonia. To add to this terrible injustice, when their wives arrived to claim their bodies, they found them in caskets, clothed in army uniforms. This incident caused all Hutterites to move to Canada. In the years following, provisions were made to accommodate conscientious objectors. In the Second World War, they served the country in the Forest Service, hospitals, and other public works projects known as civilian public service. In 1920, Eberhard Arnold began a commune, unaware of the existence of the Hutterites. He started the Röhnbrüderhof near the famous German glider school. Banished by Hitler, he moved to Liechtenstein and from there to England. After making contact with the Hutterites, Arnold was ordained as a Hutterite elder. All his groups became part of the Hutterite Brethren. Their communes moved to the United States, and they are now established on the East Coast and Pennsylvania. In 1935, a group of 500 Mennonites fled from the persecution of Stalin and, under the leadership of Siemens, escaped on a long trek over the frozen Amur River to China. Some of them went on to Paraguay and California. Amish life has become very familiar to us with the distinct dress and the horses and buggies. One-room schoolhouses are a sight reminding us of bygone days. The Amish children attend school for only 8 years. Any further education is considered superfluous. However, there is no illiteracy among the group. During the recess, the schoolyard is filled with happy children playing baseball, their favorite pastime. Unlike the Amish, Mennonites may receive higher education. The first Mennonite college to be founded was in 1893, located in Newton, Kansas. This was followed by Bluffton College in 1893, located in Bluffton, Ohio. And this was to be followed by Goshen College in Goshen, Indiana in 1903. Eastern Mennonite, founded in Harrisonburg in 1917, Rosedale Bible Institute in Berlin, Ohio, and Conrad Grebel College in Waterloo, Ontario, are all examples of Mennonite schools of higher learning. Many other colleges have been founded in the United States, and Mennonites can be found in all professions. The Hutterites, of which we see a young couple in their typical dress, have their own schools and are well educated. Family values amongst the Amish are highly valued. Work at home and out in the field is shared by all. In times of trouble, community response is immediate. In a case of fire or other disaster, the buildings are rebuilt in a very unique way. After the site has been cleared, a master builder with several helpers prepares all the timbers for the new building. On a chosen day, hundreds, sometimes up to 800 Amish men and some of their non-Amish neighbors get together and erect the barn or building in a single day. By noon, the frame is up and the barn is closed in. By 5 in the afternoon, hay and straw and the livestock are moved in, ready for the day's chores. In the meantime, the women cook and bake to feed all the workers. This is only one example of Amish cooperation and community spirit. Amish men are renowned for volunteering in disasters caused by floods, tornadoes, landslides, and fires. At the end of World War II, thousands of Mennonites who fled from the Russian army found themselves isolated in Berlin by the Iron Curtain. Stalin insisted on their repatriation and almost certain death or enslavement in labor camps. However, Mennonites in the West were able to make contact with them. After many trials and tribulations, Peter Dick and his wife Elfrida hired the ship Volendam and smuggled over 5,000 people out of the eastern zone and resettled them in Paraguay. Here, in what is called the Green Hell of the Chaco, they have established, despite great difficulties, very successful and prosperous communities. Peter and Elfrida are two of the people on the cyclorama who were still alive when this video was made, as was Dorothy Grove. Her husband, Merlin Grove, had been working in Somalia, trying to establish a school. During registration there, one young fanatic jumped over his desk and stabbed him fatally with a dagger. Running down the street, he encountered Dorothy and stabbed her 5 times. Miraculously, she survived the attack and is living in Canada. During the Vietnam War, Daniel Gerber of Kidron, Ohio, being a conscientious objector, worked at a leper hospital in Vietnam. One day, the hospital was attacked and Daniel disappeared. He is presumed dead. His fiancée, Ruth Wilting, a nurse, was also killed in Vietnam. We now show the 3 main groups of Anabaptists at their Sunday services. They all share the same basic beliefs, but their application of those beliefs differs between the diverse groups amongst them. The Hutterites all have the same lifestyle, mainly a communal life, but the Amish and the Mennonites have greater differences between them. The Amish, being the more conservative in general, refuse to use electricity, telephones, and automobiles, and work their farms with horses only. However, within the many different groups, adjustments to modern life are being introduced, from mechanical binders to cars, amongst the beachy Amish. The Amish meet for worship in a different home every second week. In the summertime, they can often be found in a barn or utility building, which is more spacious and open. The men sit on one side and the women on the other, facing each other. The preacher stands between them and delivers his sermon extemporaneously. The singing is slow and unaccompanied. A light lunch is served after the service. The ministers of the Hutterites and the Amish have no special education and are selected by drawing lots for life. There is no compensation for their services. Both Hutterite and conservative Mennonite groups sit men and women separately, facing forward. The sermons are different, since the conservatives preach freely, while the Hutterites will only read from old prepared letters and sermons. Their songs are different too. They sing somewhat faster than the Amish, but far more slowly than the more progressive Mennonites. The Hutterites sing very loudly, shouting their praises to the Lord. The more progressive Mennonites have adopted the American way of sitting together in families. Some of the women still wear their prayer coverings, and some do not. Their songs are sweetly harmonious. The ministers are trained theologians and are hired and paid by the congregation. The majority of the Mennonites live modern lifestyles with all modern amenities, including university education and highly specialized professions. However, some of their more conservative groups have been slower in accepting modern innovations, and one small group still retains simple dress and the horse and buggy. Every group, being autonomous and independent, chooses a lifestyle suited to each congregation. Disagreements, splits, and the formation of new congregations is not uncommon. The rules of each different group, beyond commonly held basic beliefs, are complex, but to non-believers may seem petty and somewhat unimportant. And so, as you see, the Anabaptist community has been in a state of constant change which has kept it vibrant, active, and alive. An Amish wedding is held in a selected house or barn, and the reception is held in another nearby. The bridal couple walks from one venue to the other, with another couple in front of them and yet another couple behind. These two attending couples are called Navahokers. The bride usually wears a darker colored dress than her bridesmaids, and these weddings are usually held on Tuesdays or Thursdays and usually in the fall. The honeymoon follows later with a visit to distant relatives. Funerals are simple, with a pine wood coffin, and burial takes place in one of the small country cemeteries, usually on top of a hill. Children, like children all over the world, are allowed to play, but their games are work-related. This brings us to the globe of the world, with children from all different nations to the babies at the feet of Christ. Our hope is that all these children will be exposed to and will follow the way of the risen Christ. Today, there are roughly 1 million Mennonites, 150,000 Amish, and 40,000 Hutterites in 80 different countries who speak over 100 languages. The Anabaptist faith has influenced beliefs in all corners of the globe through world relief efforts, disaster relief, and mission work. And so, we come to the end of our cyclorama with the hope that all you have seen, including dreadful cruelties, may give you a better understanding of the Anabaptist faith and inspire you to live a life of love and understanding, of faith and tolerance. Peace be with you.
Hi, I'm Heinz Gaugel. I hope you enjoyed Behalt, and I hope that this will become a center for learning and education, and that it will convey the message for the need of tolerance, love, understanding, and peace. Thank you very much.